I want to wrap up this chapter by looking at some misuse and abuse of confidence intervals in the real world. So earlier we talked about the way that people can word survey questions to subtly convince you of false information by embedding it in the question. So suppose Mr. Smith has not been convicted of anything, he has a clean record, but somebody comes around with a poll and they're determined to get Mr. Smith out of office. So when they come around, they say to you, you know, Mr. Smith has been convicted of a felony. Don't you think we should have him resign? And so you might not even think to question, was he actually convicted of a felony? Because it's a clause in the way that that question is asked. And it assumes it's true. And so based on that information, then you might get results that say the vast majority of people think Mr. Smith should resign, but only because they thought he had a felony when that wasn't even actually true. So people, the news, politicians, even fictional TV shows frequently make statements estimating the true population mean or population proportion and use the same subtle tricks to convince you of false information. So the biggest warning sign that you're being misled is that when someone gives you a single value as an estimate rather than a range of values. So this process that we've learned of making a confidence interval and estimating a population mean always results in a range of values. So if someone only gives you a single value, some kind of logical questions to ask here are, what end of the range did the person choose? Did they choose the low end? Did they choose the high end? Choosing one or the other of those could skew people's opinion on that topic. Or maybe they chose the center thinking that that was probably a safe thing to do, but that also is going to distort that. And then in terms of fictional TV show citing statistics, especially ones that seem really realistic, like maybe some sort of courtroom drama or something like that, when the prosecutor that is doing this fictional TV show cites a statistic to convince the jury, it's really easy for us to just accept that at face value that it must be true. And so a good question to ask is that statistic that was in this fictional show based on research, or is it just something out of the writer's imagination? So there's lots of ways that these confidence intervals can be misused and abused. Even when confidence intervals are calculated and stated correctly, they can still lead to problems. People or companies can use those intervals to make decisions that would be considered financially sound, but morally bankrupt. So one example of this, and this happens in a lot of industries, so I'm not just picking on this one company, but this is a pretty well-known example. So GM waited nearly 10 years before issuing a recall for a faulty ignition that would shut off the car while driving, potentially leading to the death or injury of those in the vehicles. When looking at calculations such as the anticipated number of injuries and deaths and the expected payout for those deaths, versus the cost of a recall, executives decided that the recall would be too expensive in comparison with the insurance payouts for a small number of people dying. So they chose to keep this quiet, this whole issue with this ignition switch, for almost 10 years before they finally issued this recall and fixed that. So even though that interval was correct in all likelihood, and it was stated correctly, people still found a way to misuse that. So it's really good to think about when you hear statistics being cited around you, where did they really come from and what are they really trying to say?